In January of 1890, 47,000 census enumerators fanned out across the United States, carrying standardized forms, sharpened pencils, and explicit instructions from the Department of the Interior. Over the course of several weeks, they knocked on doors in every state, every territory, every reservation boundary. They recorded the names, ages, occupations, and family structures of 62,979,766 people. It was the most ambitious census the nation had ever attempted, the first to use Herman Hollerith's electric tabulating machines, the first to categorize citizens by mortgage status, the first to document the languages spoken in every household. The data filled thousands of volumes. The original schedules, the raw, handwritten, door-to-door records, occupied an entire floor of the Commerce Building in Washington. Today, almost none of it exists. The official explanation is fire, a single fire, on January 10, 1921, in the basement of the Commerce Building. But the 1921 fire did not destroy the 1890 census. Not entirely. Not immediately. What happened to those records is slower, stranger, and far more deliberate than a single afternoon of flame. And the absence they left behind is not just a gap in a filing cabinet. It is a hole in the identity of millions of American families, a hole that, once you examine how it was made, raises questions about what we have been told about the preservation of public memory in the United States. The fire itself is where most accounts begin and end. A basement blaze in the Commerce Department building at the corner of 19th and F Streets, Northwest Washington. It started sometime around 5 in the afternoon. The exact origin was never conclusively determined. Official reports cited faulty wiring in the wooden storage racks, though the building's electrical system had been flagged for upgrades 3 years prior and no work had been completed. Firefighters from Engine Company No. 7 arrived within minutes. The fire was contained within hours. No one was killed, no one was seriously injured. But water, thousands of gallons of it, poured through the floor and into the basement stacks where the census volumes were stored. Here is the first detail that most histories omit. The fire did not occur in the room where the 1890 schedules were kept. It started in an adjacent storage area and spread through the ceiling. The primary damage to the census records came not from burning, but from water and smoke. Subsequent damage reports filed by the Census Bureau itself, now held in the National Archives, described the 1890 population schedules as having sustained damage ranging from minor legible with effort to severe. But the language of those reports is critical. They do not say the records were destroyed, they say the records were damaged. Approximately 25% of the original population schedules were described in internal memoranda as partially salvageable. Yet within 2 years, every surviving fragment of the 1890 population schedules had been authorized for destruction. That authorization did not come from a fire chief. It did not come from an insurance adjuster. It came from the Librarian of Congress and the Chief of the Census Bureau through a series of internal memoranda that are themselves surprisingly difficult to locate in complete form. On February 28, 1921, 9 days after the fire, the Census Bureau's chief clerk sent a letter to the Secretary of Commerce recommending that the damaged schedules be sold as waste paper. On March 22, a follow-up memorandum noted that Congress had not yet responded to the recommendation. On December 1, 1921, nearly a full year after the fire, Congress authorized the destruction of the damaged schedules. The actual physical destruction, the pulping, did not occur until January 1923. Let those dates sit for a moment. The fire happened in January 1921. The physical destruction happened in January 1923. For 2 full years, damaged but partially legible records of 63 million Americans sat in government storage, and during that window, no organized effort was made to transcribe, photograph, or preserve them. In 1921, photographic reproduction technology existed. The Library of Congress had been photographing fragile documents since the 1900s. The Smithsonian had developed preservation protocols for fire-damaged paper as early as 1915. None of these resources were deployed. And this is where the pattern begins to take shape, not as a single event, but as a sequence of decisions. To understand why the loss of the 1890 census is not simply an archival tragedy, but a structural one, you need to see what that census contained that no other census of its era captured. The 1890 enumeration was conducted under a special act that expanded the questionnaire beyond anything previously attempted. For the first time, enumerators recorded whether homes were owned outright or mortgaged. They documented the number of months each person had been unemployed in the previous year. They recorded the ability of each person to speak English, and if not, which language they spoke. They noted whether each person was a Civil War veteran, and if so, which unit they served in. A separate schedule, the special schedule for surviving soldiers, sailors, and Marines, and widows, recorded pension status, nature of disability, and military service history for every Union veteran and widow in the country. That special veterans schedule survived. Roughly half of it, covering states alphabetically from Kentucky through Wyoming, remains in the National Archives today. But the population schedules, the ones that recorded who lived where, what they owned, what languages they spoke, what work they did, those are gone. And their loss falls at a very specific seam in American history. The 1890 census was the first to be taken after the closing of the frontier. It was the first to capture the full demographic impact of the great wave of immigration, the millions of Southern and Eastern Europeans who arrived between 1880 and 1890. It was the first to document in household-level detail the conditions of formerly enslaved people and their children a full generation after emancipation. It was, in effect, the first modern snapshot of what America actually looked like once you moved past the mythology, and it was the one that was destroyed. The 1880 census survives. The 1900 census survives. Every census from 1790 to 1880 and from 1900 forward survives in nearly complete form. Only 1890 is gone. The statistical probability of a single fire selectively destroying the one census that captured the most transformative decade in American demographic history is not something that can be calculated in a meaningful way, because it was not the fire alone that destroyed it. It was the fire, followed by the inaction, followed by the authorization, followed by the pulping. 4 steps, each one a decision made by a specific person in a specific office on a specific date. Now introduce the second pattern. The destruction of the 1890 census did not occur in isolation. It occurred during a period in which the federal government was systematically reducing its documentary footprint regarding several categories of population data. Between 1900 and 1930, the Bureau of Indian Affairs destroyed or transferred to inaccessible storage an estimated 60% of its tribal enrollment records from the allotment era. The General Land Office, which administered homestead claims, experienced 3 separate fires between 1877 and 1930, each of which damaged records pertaining to land title disputes involving indigenous and formerly enslaved claimants. The Freedmen's Bureau records, which documented land grants, marriages, and labour contracts for 4 million formerly enslaved people, were transferred from the War Department to the Treasury Department to the National Archives across 4 decades, during which significant portions were lost, misfiled, or rendered inaccessible through deterioration in unsuitable storage. These are not speculative claims. They are documented in the administrative histories maintained by the National Archives and Records Administration itself. NARA's own internal histories note the uneven preservation of population-sensitive records during this period and acknowledge that institutional neglect, inadequate storage, and delayed preservation funding contributed to losses that were, in their careful language, disproportionately concentrated in records relating to minority and economically disadvantaged populations. That phrase deserves a second reading. Disproportionately concentrated. Not randomly distributed. Not equally affecting all record types. Concentrated. In records about specific people. The 1890 census was, by the standards of its era, the most complete portrait of those specific people ever assembled in a single document. It captured the first generation born free. It captured the immigrant families who had not yet anglicized their names. It captured the tribal members who had been assigned allotment lands. It captured the veterans who were filing disability claims. It captured, in short, the people who would most need documentary proof of their identity, their residence, and their property in the decades that followed, decades that brought Jim Crow, immigration restriction, allotment fraud, and the systematic rewriting of who belonged where and since when. Here is where the two patterns converge, and where the investigation shifts from archival history to something that touches the architecture of institutional memory itself. When a government destroys the record of a population, it does not erase the people. They continue to exist. Their children continue to exist, but the relationship between those people and the state changes in a specific and measurable way. Without records, a family cannot prove continuous residence. Without proof of continuous residence, property claims become vulnerable. Without property claims, economic stability erodes. Without economic stability, political power contracts. The destruction of a census is not the destruction of paper, it is the destruction of proof. And proof, in a legal system built on documentation, is the difference between a right and a memory. Consider what happened in the decades immediately following the loss of the 1890 census. Genealogists working on African American family histories hit what researchers now call the 1890 wall, a documentary void between 1880 and 1900 that makes it nearly impossible to trace family movement, property ownership, or community formation during the single most critical decade of post-emancipation life. Native American tribal members attempting to verify allotment claims found that cross-referencing with census data, a standard verification method, was impossible for 1890, the precise year many allotments were being contested. Immigrant families seeking to document arrival and settlement patterns for naturalization proceedings discovered that the household-level detail that would have confirmed their presence in 1890 no longer existed. Each of these consequences is documented in case files, legal proceedings, and genealogical research archives. None of them were hypothetical. They were experienced by specific families, in specific courtrooms, in specific decades. And in each case, the absence of the 1890 census was not an inconvenience. It was a wall. The question of whether this destruction was intentional in the conspiratorial sense, whether someone decided to burn those specific records for those specific reasons, is not one that existing evidence can definitively answer. What existing evidence can answer is a different question, and perhaps a more important one. Was every reasonable effort made to prevent the loss? And the documented record of institutional decisions between January 1921 and January 1923 answers that question with uncomfortable clarity. The technology to preserve existed. The institutional knowledge to preserve existed. The time to preserve existed 2 full years of it. What did not exist, apparently, was the institutional will, and the absence of will when the records at stake belong disproportionately to the most vulnerable populations in the country, is not a neutral absence. It is a decision that carries weight, even if no memorandum ever explicitly states its reasons. There is physical proof of what was lost, and it still exists in scattered, fragmentary form. In 1935, a Works Progress Administration project in several southern states attempted to reconstruct portions of the 1890 census from county tax rolls, church records, and local registries. Some of those reconstruction files survive in state archives in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, and they reveal a level of demographic detail, household compositions, property valuations, literacy rates that confirms just how granular the original schedules were. A handful of original 1890 census fragments also survive, approximately 6,400 names from Rockland County, New York, portions of several New Jersey municipalities, fragments from a few Alabama counties. These fragments are held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. They are legible, they are detailed, they are enough to show exactly what was in the volumes that were pulped. In 2000, a team of archival researchers at the University of North Carolina Cross referenced the surviving fragments with contemporaneous local records and found that the 1890 schedules contained information that appeared in no other federal document of the period. Household-level mortgage data. Individual-level unemployment duration. Language spoken at home. These fields were not repeated in the 1900 census. They were unique to 1890. Their loss is not duplicated anywhere in the federal record. There are also the Hollerith punch cards. Herman Hollerith's tabulating machines processed the 1890 data by encoding each person's information onto a perforated card, which was then read by an electrical counting machine. Thousands of those original punch cards were stored separately from the paper schedules. Their fate is less well documented than the schedules themselves. Internal Census Bureau records from the 1910s reference the cards as being in storage, but no comprehensive inventory of their destruction has been located. If the cards survived the fire, and there is no record indicating they were in the Commerce Building basement in 1921, they represent a parallel dataset that could, in theory, have been used to reconstruct the lost population schedules. No such reconstruction was ever attempted. No official explanation for the decision not to attempt it has been located. That absence, the absence of an explanation, is its own kind of evidence. Not evidence of conspiracy. Evidence of priority. Evidence of what a government considers worth saving and what it considers acceptable to lose. Stand in the National Archives today, in College Park, Maryland, and request the 1890 census records. You will be given a single microfilm reel containing the surviving fragments. 6,400 names out of 63 million. A fraction of a fraction of a percent. The rest is gone, not because a fire was too powerful to fight, not because technology was too primitive to preserve, but because in the 2 years between the fire and the pulping, a series of officials in a series of offices decided, one memorandum at a time, that the most complete portrait of Gilded Age America was not worth the effort of saving. The 1880 census is there, on the shelf beside it. The 1900 census is there. Every decade accounted for, stretching back to the first enumeration ordered by George Washington in 1790. One gap. One decade. The decade when the frontier closed, when millions arrived, when the first generation born out of slavery came of age, when the modern country began. That is the decade that is missing. The fire burned for a few hours. The decisions that followed burned for 2 years. And the silence that remains has lasted a century, a silence shaped not like an accident, but like an answer to a question nobody was supposed to ask. 63 million names, written down once, in a country that promised to count everyone. The names are gone. The promise is still on the books.